While it's nice to bring new fans into the genre of JRPGs, regaling them with fantastical worlds and gripping gameplay, it's also fun to find games that will send them home crying to mum. Here are 7 JRPGs that are not beginner friendly. And where else do we start for a list like this than Shin Megami Tensei? As a franchise, it's infamous for its difficulty. SMT is unforgiving and requires deep understanding of in-game mechanics to overcome some of the more brutal challenges in JRPGs across the spectrum. Still an amazing franchise, mind you, but undoubtedly not beginner friendly. Even so, which one is the most challenging? I've only played 3 of them myself, Nocturne 4 and 5, and it's definitely not 5 for me. I had much less trouble with the latest iteration than I did Nocturnal 4. Both of the other games though wrecked me several times, and I often lost plenty of progress as a result on many occasions. But as I scanned through my notes from my previous playthroughs, I asked myself which one puts more dread in me when I think of replaying it. And after asking myself that, the answer is obvious. It's Shin Megami Tensei 4. Nocturne is difficult, let's confirm that right away. It is one of the most infamous fights in JRPGs that not only is a difficulty spike, but comes literally out of nowhere. What makes it worse though is that the fight occurs very early on. You're just finding your feet and boom, there you go. Those who were unprepared were likely forced to take an early L and come back for another round. So what makes 4 worse than this? Well, quite simply, it doesn't have one early game terror, it has 2, within like the first 5 hours. SMT4's welcome to new players is pretty much the equivalent of Spartan training, where kids were sent to brave the wilds by themselves to toughen them up. You beat the first one of these menaces and feel a wave of euphoria, only to realise an arguably tougher one is right after it. There is no doubt that SMT4 has a host of powerhouses that make up the adventure, but I found them to be much more manageable, because by then you've got a lot more options to work with. In those early stages, you have no such luxury. You have limited items and demons to work with, along with a fairly weak samurai who hasn't come close to fully realise potential. SMT4 is still my favourite of the 3 games I've played personally, but I can't deny that those opening moments were rough. And talking about rough, it feels only right to include this game too. Now, while I don't have any of the Saga franchise in this list because I have no experience with those games, it does feel right to at least include a JRPG that some of their development team worked on, and that is The Last Remnant. This was sort of a testing of the waters phase for Square as they incorporated a third-party engine, namely Unreal Engine 3, to make The Last Remnant a reality, and what we got was, well, this. I abandoned this game way back when, mostly due to technical issues at first and a bland story along with Vanilla Protag 101 Rush Sykes as the cherry on top. But it's undoubtedly the battle system that puts Last Remnant on this list. I actually thought it was pretty good, but it is notably opaque in design. Instead of issuing direct input, you take on the role of a pseudo-commander giving contextual-based commands that the squads act out, and over time, those units will gradually improve with their own skills. What I really like though is that the outcome of battle is largely dependent on morale, which in of itself places heavy importance on how you position your squads. Flanking and surrounding units can have a notable impact on this element, which, like in real life, reflects the flow of eventual combat outcomes. Those with strong morale are more likely to wipe the opposing unit out. The thing with Last Remnant though is that it is not beginner friendly because it effectively punishes you for grinding, or at least doing so on lower level mobs. It all comes down to the mechanic known as the battle rank. The idea is that units and character strength are determined by stats. The battle rank is basically a measure of that strength of the party versus the enemy. If you have a lower battle rank than the enemy, then you gain more stats upon beating them. On the other side, if you have a higher battle rank than enemies, then the game will aim to increase the damage of those enemies in order to balance it out. The ratio of battle rank to stats becomes the hardest thing to contend with, but in general, the best method is to simply avoid fights altogether, except against single unit enemies that are often a higher battle rank than you anyway. It's an odd system to say the least, and far from traditional. Last Remnant undoubtedly has a cult following, but it flattered to deceive for many. It's not necessarily a case of the game being difficult, it was more a case of it being the equivalent of the Da Vinci Code in JRPG form. The next game on the list though is not exactly complex, it's just defined more by a single mechanic that can make a playthrough more stressful than normal. Especially odd when considering the franchise it comes from is known more for being relaxing and carefree. It's the second Ireland game in Atelier Tutori, which is undoubtedly for me the hardest Atelier game I've played thus far, and I've played a lot of them. That being said, it is also my favourite of the Island games, despite mine not being a fan of time-based adventures, but I've gone more into depth as to why on my dedicated Island video if you want to check it out. Initially, let's go over the technical issues. Compared to Atelier DX, which is the first game in the Island Quartet, Totori felt like a massive step down convenience-wise. There were so many quality of life aspects that were in Rorona that were just missing in Totori. That is because the DX version of Atelier Rorona was based on its remake, Atelier Rorona Plus, which added a bunch of conveniences to bring it up to the modern standards of the time, which at that point was Escher and Logi, the second Dusk game. Totori DX, on the other hand, did not get the same treatment and was simply a port of the Vita version with some added content. Simply playing the two back to back will come as a shock to the system, since for all intents a sequel should have ironed out the issues from the first game, right? The real shock though comes in the time limit. The whole premise is centered around Totori becoming an adventurer, but her adventuring license will require renewal in 3 years. During that time, Totori must show she is worthy of being an adventurer or her license will be revoked. By earning license points through activity in the world, she is able to rank up periodically, and this allows her to go to ever more dangerous areas as she gains experience. If she is able to meet these requirements, the game eventually stretches to 6 years come the end. Not only does travelling across the map and alchemy take up precious time, even gathering and combat do the same thing. At the start, gathering will take up half a day, while combat will take up 2 bars of a day, and it's surprisingly unforgiving in terms of unlocking certain events and meeting milestones that I had to restart the game not once but twice. If you're aiming for that true ending, there is very little chance you will get it on a blind first playthrough. A guide is pretty much required. While I do love Atelier Totori as a game, as I feel it strikes a great balance between adventuring and alchemy as the core of the journey, it is not for the faint-hearted. As is the case with this next sequel, or prequel in this case, and it's for Barton Kaitos Origin. Now, I loved the first game, I made that apparent last year. The original Barton Kaitos was a breath of fresh air from everything I played in 2023, so unique and a link to the past in many ways, when games weren't afraid to let you go off and figure the mechanics out yourself. This year, I played Origin as well, quite recently in fact, and guess what? I love that game too. It's slightly below the original for me, but it's still an 8.8 out of 10 if I were to put a rating on it. Players who enjoyed the first game will be happy to know that Origin carries over many common elements. Exploration is mostly the same, the world is going to have very familiar locales, though there are some new ones here and there, and the use of the Magnus, which are basically these cards that capture the essence of various things around the world, become a core part of the game experience, both in terms of battle and exploration. Still, would I recommend Origin to a player completely unfamiliar with JRPGs? If I hated them, maybe. But anyone else? Hell no. The original was already quite a shift from a traditional gameplay experience, but Origin magnifies it by several decibels. The foundation is similar, you have decks of Magnus that you use to attack, and the idea is to work in ascending order. But there is no doubt that Origin depends much more on quick thinking and fast reflexes. One of the biggest differences in Origin is that all 3 characters will be using the same deck. There are no individual decks in this game. Magnus are numbered from 1 to 7, with basic attacks noted from 1 to 3, and then you eventually make it into your finishing moves, which are numbered from 4 to 7, with the ideal execution being to see a full combo through to the end. In many cases this won't happen, you first need to build up mana through smaller combos to even use your high-end finishers, and that mana gauge is shown on the right hand of the screen. Once you hit level 5, you can go into a mana burst state and freely use your finishers as long as they are in order. This ability to think fast and scan across the Magnus under pressure is ultimately why I would say this game is difficult, especially when you consider that discarding cards is also important. I absolutely adore the combat system, but there's no doubt in my mind that it will be a love or hate deal for players. Some will lament the fast pace for what is essentially a turn-based game, while others will thrive and enjoy the challenge the game offers. And talking about challenge, while the original was a tough nut in of itself, Origin is harder, and I've got no doubts in saying that. There are notable spikes in difficulty with some of these bosses. One in particular was so tough I was convinced you were meant to lose. So imagine my horror when I was shown a game over screen and forced to try again. It's not unfair difficulty per se, any challenge can be overcome by adjusting your deck, but it can absolutely wipe you out with nary a second thought. The fifth entry is a return to the Ys series and the games that started it all for one of Falcom's biggest franchises in Ys 1 and 2, specifically the Chronicles Plus versions on Steam. It takes place in the land of Asteria, and Adol is tasked with finding the 6 books of Ys to eventually stop a great evil. The story itself, though direct and satisfying in its own way, is definitely a product of that period, as is much of the rest of the game. And that's mostly why the games are on this list. They are dated. Great games for me, but they are certainly going to be resonating with a niche audience. That thought process rings true, especially in regards to gameplay, as the bump system that is utilised here has its charm, but it's certainly an acquired taste. You'll often have to run into enemies from behind or attack them at an angle to ensure Adol doesn't meet an early demise, and that alone can be a point of contention. Not having an attack button in the modern era just sounds like game design blasphemy. There's also very little in the way of direction given to the player. It's not uncommon to have no idea where you're meant to go, plus you have to ensure that Adol is consistently at an adequate level, lest you get destroyed by later areas. The biggest challenge though is that final boss in Ys 1, without question, and it's not a fair fight either, it's just frustrating. Even the most avid Ys fans will admit that. And that's because of a technical oversight. Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles Plus can be played at 60 FPS, and indeed higher, as you would expect of an older title on the PC. The problem though is that this final boss was not geared towards the game running at 60 FPS, and what happens is that said boss moves far faster than was originally intended. It is possible to win, but the best strategy is to literally lower the frame cap to 30 FPS so that he becomes manageable. Quite hilarious when you think about it, but frustrating nonetheless. No doubt I love the first 2 Ys games, as I do with pretty much every entry in the franchise, and I would recommend them to more seasoned JRPG players who are interested in trying out Ys as a whole, but for a newcomer, no chance, even with their short runtime. The penultimate game on this list will be a remake of a beloved classic in Star Ocean Second Story R. It's a great game, no doubt about that, but there can be no denying that it also has mad difficulty spikes. That is, if you're not using the mechanics that you should. Simply leveling up in Star Ocean Second Story R will not cut it. The game places way more importance on a skill and crafting system that, let's face it, many people won't even look at in many cases. The meat of the combat is pretty good. It's a nice take on an action RPG that does show its age at points, but it is undoubtedly fun. A lot of characters to try out, plentiful amounts of skills to mix and match, and a decent level of options given to the player in terms of group formations that grant additional bonuses in battle. However, if you simply stick to combat and leveling up, you'll eventually hit some hard walls. The method of success in this adventure all comes down to the skills and specialties. Every character has a host of these tied to them, and they all have a specific use. For instance, you can make new weapons, but then you can customize them further into ridiculously powerful versions early on. Customization is at the forefront of this game, and they all enrich the gameplay in a multitude of ways, either through combat, equipment management, or traversing the world itself. It is easily the best part about the game, and I get the impression that freedom was the modus operandi of Star Ocean 2. No single playthrough would ever be the same. It results in a plethora of ways to outright break the game, and ultimately if you understand the systems early on, you'll steamroll nearly everything even on higher difficulties. A lot of people though, especially those who had never played the original, would not fall into this category, and simply saw a game that got harder as the hours passed by. It's not a traditional way of circumventing difficulty, but I do think the game is better off for it. The final game for this list will be Fire Emblem, with my personal favourite in Radiant Dawn. It might be nostalgia, since it was the first time I was introduced to the franchise, but even if I played it now, I am confident I would adore the game, and I'm still punching the air that I was able to find a physical copy at my local Sex, complete in box 2, and for a really good price it has to be said. Very happy to have it in my collection. Whether it was the backdrop of Warring Kingdoms, the excellent strategic gameplay, or its decent cast of characters, I could just not pull myself away from Radiant Dawn. It was the perfect way to get me into the Fire Emblem franchise, and I haven't looked back since. Saying that, despite being well received for the most part, I think it often gets overshadowed by Path of Radiance, but that's a conversation for another day. Rather, let's go over that difficulty. Like many of the earlier games, permadeath is a thing in Radiant Dawn, but it is also one of the harder games in the franchise even when compared to contemporaries. Map layouts are on average more complex, enemy AI is just cheap at times, and battles can draw on for quite a while. and that's disregarding the glaring translation issue that Radiant Dawn was plagued with when it first released. In short, the prequel, Path of Radiance, changed the difficulties for the Western release. It removed the Maniac mode and replaced it with standard easy, normal and hard modes. The thought process was that Radiant Dawn would do the same, but it didn't. The difficulties were exactly the same as the Japanese release, those being normal, hard and Maniac. But when translated for Western audiences, those difficulties became easy, normal and hard. In other words, those who played on normal difficulty were actually playing on hard mode, a hard mode that was already more challenging than other contemporaries too. Once again, just like East 1 and 2, it's a situation you just laugh at nowadays, but back then, I imagine the quote, normal mode of Radiant Dawn caused quite a few Wiimotes to be chucked out the window. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.